Hello.
Hello.
Oh, hey Tony, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
Well, why don't I? Everybody here knows who I am, so why don't I let you introduce yourself?
Okay, my name's Dr. Tony Cumming. I'm an independent author. I've written two books, one, The Royal Navy and the Battle of Britain, and the book I think we're going to talk about, The Battle for Britain, Inter-Service Rivalry between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, 1909 to 1940.
As everyone knows, my name is Rob Farley. I work at the Patterson School at the University of Kentucky, and I also have an interest in Air Force and naval and inter-service conflict, and so that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation today. So, to start off, I just wanted to get us all on the same page here.
Sure.
What is this thing? What are the boundaries of the thing that we call the Battle of Britain? It seems like an obvious thing. We've all seen movies. Well, I even showed my daughters. One of the Frank Capra movies from the 1940s about what the Battle of Britain was. But in historians' terms, what do we treat as the Battle?
It's a problem. It's a problem, really, because as far as most people are concerned, the Battle of Britain is the air fight between the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe over southern England in 1940, an air battle that was a decisive victory that prevented an invasion. Okay. This has caused a number of problems because most people consider, it seems, that the RAF's actions, the heroic actions of the few, actually prevented an invasion. Obviously, I don't feel that's quite so simple. I feel we need to talk about the wider battle for Britain, and I think that term "battle for Britain" is very important because the reason that Hitler didn't invade this country in 1940, I believe, was because of the overwhelming strength of the Royal Navy. The Royal Air Force had some importance, not so much operationally, but in reality, it had a lot more to do with propaganda and with influencing the United States of America. The importance was in trying to increase the flow of logistical support to this country. That was what really mattered in 1940. Now, the person who originally defined the Battle of Britain, of course, was Winston Churchill. When he talked about the Battle of Britain in the immediate post-Dunkirk era, he made an ample reference to all three services. So initially, it wasn't an exclusive air fight that prevented invasion. This changed a little later on. It's pretty obvious why it did change. That's really because you can put a newsreel camera in front of aircraft on the ground, and also you can film combats in the sky. And it's something that you can actually see. War correspondents from America and Britain would gather at Dover and they would look upwards. They would see the combats, they would see the vapor trails, they could see the bombs fall, and it all seemed to be about the pilots. But of course, what people couldn't see at this particular point was everything else that was going on, the things that were going on in the Mediterranean, the things that were going on in the English Channel, the constant patrols that were going on to monitor invasion activity, the attacks on the invasion ports to bombard the invasion barges, fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. All these things couldn't be seen by the newsreel camera.
Right. And perhaps a useful way to think about this from sort of a little bit farther time perspective is to think about everything that went into Operation Overlord in 1944 in terms of the immense level of preparation that
yes, quite so.
took.
Quite so. The Germans had to cobble together an improvised operation with Rhine River barges towed in long trains with tugboats. An armada that can only make something like 3 knots. And remember that the Germans had only, a few months in which to prepare this invasion. The last date they could reasonably invade was, I think it was something like the 24th of September. I think that was the date that they were working to. And they could only really start preparing this in June. It didn't have much time, but when you think about how long it took to prepare for Operation Overlord, which was by comparison years, then you can see how difficult it would have been for the Germans.
I mean, and the resources the Allies devoted in 1944 were vastly in excess of anything the Germans had available to them.
I think actually the German extemporizations were very clever. And I think some of their experience came in very useful. I mean, they introduced some swimming tanks, for example, and all that was very useful for their invasions in the Baltic later on. But I think the trouble with the German army was that it didn't really appreciate the complexities of maritime operations. I remember reading one story about von Rundsted's staff car that was left on the beach. He went off to get some lunch, and when he came back, the staff car was floating out to sea. So the English Channel is a very volatile stretch of water. The German army tended to think about the British Channel as just a river, because it's nothing like a river. There's a massive rise and fall of the tide. The channel is about 100 miles long, 200 miles long, I should say, at one end, and about 18 miles wide at its narrowest point. So you get this massive amount of water that flows back and forth twice a day. That causes immense complications. The topography of the channel, the seabed is very uneven, the sands keep shifting, the various currents. It's very, very difficult. I feel that the key defect in the German plan was that the army wanted them to land at dawn. They wanted a dawn attack. Armies usually do. But the trouble is, that meant having to cross the channel at night. Well, what role could aircraft then play? I would suggest very little, very little. I mean, at this particular point, the RAF didn't have the equipment to find potential invasion fleet, and then once they found it, to actually sink it. It didn't have the weaponry, the training, or any means of doing so. The Luftwaffe couldn't influence the operation either, not in darkness. And then when the morning comes, of course, then you're likely to have ships all over the place. You'll probably have destroyers mixed in with the German landing craft. You have all the problems of friendly fire. It's just not a goer.
Right. And we can imagine, and we can imagine a situation because the invasion doesn't stop at dawn, right? The landing of the troops starts at dawn.
Yes,
but then
right.
You have to, with reinforcements and logistical support and everything else. And in the evening, when the Luftwaffe was no longer able to even threaten to keep the Royal Navy out of this situation, they would feast upon destroyers, and even send down an R-class battleship or something like that, would feast upon German efforts to conduct resupply, right? And so the entire thing seems sort of very sketchy if Britain does not surrender as soon as the first German soldier lands across the Channel.
Yes, of course, it's very difficult indeed. The Germans have got to get their landing craft back off the beach, so they've got to wait for hours before those landing craft can be brought off again, can be floated off the beach. So there's quite a long interval in between each wave. And really, after about 24 hours, you know that substantial reinforcements are going to arrive from Rosyth. If the local naval flotillas based in Plymouth, Portsmouth, the Nore, the Humber can't deal with the situation, then the heavy ships will have to intervene. And I know the conventional idea is that heavy ships can't survive in the Channel, but I would point out that, yes, it would be more difficult for them to operate than in other areas. But having said that, the Germans proved that it was possible because, as in 1942, the two Scharnhorst battleships and a battle cruiser came through the English Channel in broad daylight, January 1942, I believe it was, Operation Cerberus. Yeah, well, they managed it. They incurred some minor damage, and the RAF actually managed to make an interception, but it didn't make any difference. I think one of the ships was hit by a mine, but it still managed to carry on. And a whole formation of Fleet Air Arm torpedo bombers were shot down in the process. So I think it's very dangerous to assume that capital ships could never operate in the English Channel. And what we're talking about is a Royal Navy that's at least 10 times as powerful as the German Navy. They've got hardly any destroyers left after the Norway operation. I know Norway, in most terms, was a defeat for Britain, but I think in naval terms it was definitely a victory.
Badly led the Kriegsmarine, right?
Absolutely. Admiral Raeder acknowledged this in his memoirs. Churchill acknowledged it in his histories of the Second World War. He said after Norway, the German Navy was no factor in the supreme issue of the invasion of Great Britain. So, it's quite interesting, really, that if you look at some of the things that Hitler says afterwards, for example, he says, poor little Navy. The British Navy is 15 times as strong as their little Navy. So, he's exaggerating this himself. But 10 times superiority is really quite a significant advantage. And Admiral Raeder is obviously Admiral Raeder can't say, oh, the operation stands no chance of success, let's call it off. You can't possibly say that to somebody like Hitler. You have to say something like, oh, yes, very good idea, my Führer, excellent. Just a few little problems we have to deal with here, but I'm sure we can sort it all out. And then you gradually introduce more and more problems, and then he gets fed up and starts thinking about something else. But although personally, I doubt if Hitler was ever really serious about invading this country. He knew he couldn't do it. And the reason that Raeder went to him in the first place, according to his own memoirs, was to try and stop some irresponsible person from going to him and saying, let's invade Britain because we've done so well in Norway. Surely we can invade Britain. It's going to be easy. So, that was the idea, to try and prepare Hitler's mind for, for all the difficulties. And I think actually he succeeded.
And I wonder if sort of some of the misunderstanding of of German purposes in 1940 may be linked to how we have interpreted 1938 and 1939 in terms of that in 1940 Hitler may genuinely have been bluffing about this. In terms of talking about this, it may be best to be interpreted as a bluff that was intended to sort of bring about either a British surrender or a abandonment of the British cause, right? And that's the best way to intend it, rather than as sort of as an operationally plausible purpose of the war.
Quite so.
So I think we've actually covered quite a bit of stuff. I want to return to some of the propaganda stuff in a second.
Sure.
But your earlier book is the one that concentrates a lot on these early war questions of how the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force are preventing essentially the defeat of Britain. The book we're talking about now, The Battle for Britain, is more about the interwar conflicts, and this is something that I've also written in my own work.
Yes. Yeah.
So can you sketch out for us, this battle between the Royal Air Force and the other services, but especially between the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy in the interwar years, and how this led to this situation that we have in 1940?
Sure. Well, of course, the book starts in 1909, so I've gone, in fact, before the First World War to try and see how it all starts, starting from Blériot's flight across the Channel, where I think is where it really all starts. But of course, from 1918, we have an independent Air Force that has this controversial bombing philosophy. And the difficulty, of course, for Lord Trenchard, who's now head of the Royal Air Force, is that is faced with losing his entire organisation, because there are constant demands in the press for the organisation to be broken up and the aircraft returned to the Army and the Navy. Now, this is despite the fact that during the war, the Navy put up no real opposition to the proposal to create a Royal Air Force. But of course, they changed their mind. Right. Trenchard had to find a new way of justifying the RAF's existence, because it was under extreme pressure. Admiral Beatty was now arguing for the fleet's air power to be returned, but he wasn't getting anywhere. Trenchard had to find a new role, and that role became protection of the empire, imperial policing, in other words. And that's, I think history seems to have regarded this as a great success. It seemed to start off very well because aircraft were used to deal with a small police action. I can't quite remember where that was now.
The first one was in Sudan, right? Or was it Somalia?
Somalia, I think it was, and that was seen as a great success. And then later on, it was argued that air power would be very useful in trying to control the protectorate in Iraq, which is called Mesopotamia at that time, as you know. Now, Mesopotamia was a very expensive United League of Nations mandate to protect. It was costing an extremely large amount of money. The chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, really didn't want it. He tried to convince the politicians that they should get out, but they weren't having any of it. So Trenchard came up with this, Lord Hugh Trenchard came up with this proposal at the Cairo conference that if the Air Ministry could take over the protection of Mesopotamia from rebel insurgents, then it could all be done a lot more cheaply. And it would give a chance for everybody to see how effective the air weapon could work in isolation from all the other services. Of course, in practice, it didn't quite work out like that. It did appear to be very successful on the face of it, but it still required ground units, armoured car units, actually under the control of the Royal Air Force and a large number of Iraq levies, but it was still necessary to use very substantial land forces. And I think as James Coram has pointed out, at one point, the administration of Mesopotamia passed to the government of India. So the burden of defence of India financially fell upon India rather than the British Treasury. So that, in part anyway, enabled the British to claim, or the RAF to claim, that the war had been conducted at a fraction of the cost that would otherwise have been the case. So I think quite a lot of financial sleight of hand went on here. I think it may well have suited Sir Samuel Haw's political purpose to accept this. And so I think as a result of this, it made the RAF's position secure for the time being. And then, of course, later on, we have all these very complex and imaginative theories of air power come into play from Italy's General Douay, of course. He publishes his famous book about air power in 1921-22, something like that. And then we have homegrown air power theorists like Percy Groves, Groves, I believe, addresses a conference of London doctors and says, well, what will happen in the next war is that an enemy air force, and of course it'll be the French, will drop gas bombs on London, and hopefully it'll just be knockout gas, but it might not be, and the war would be won before it even started. So his sort of priming public opinion and is trying to work up a panic. And of course, the Northcliffe Press, who have always been very pro-air right from 1909, support this. And I think in the process of trying to support this new air arm, that they're knocking the Navy all the time by publishing pictures in newspapers, showing warships casually being blown out of existence by biplane bombers. So.
And sort of the American contribution to this, of course, comes in the form of Billy Mitchell, who destroys an ancient German, not an ancient exactly, it was a dreadnought battleship, but an aging German battleship that was not maneuvering.
It wasn't moving, wasn't conducting an air defence, and I think I'm right in saying it was leaking anyway.
It was, right. The ship was not one. It had been looted. It had been looted by American sailors. Yeah,
it wasn't realistic at all. But I suppose it was some indication of what could be done. But it didn't really prove anything very much. But I think probably it was enough to convince politicians, British politicians, and possibly American politicians. But I think on the whole, American politicians have been far more sensible in resisting the claims of some of these air power theorists. And you had the Dwight Moe Aircraft Board in the 1920s, which looked at all these things, including Mitchell's experiments, and and they were looking at demands from these air power theorists for a unification of all the air arms, and they weren't convinced at all. And I think it's perhaps fair to say, I think it's A.D. Harvey points out that Trenchard wasn't as vociferous as some American air power proponents were. Right. I think that's probably true. But nonetheless, I think one advantage of your system in America is that all these things were out in the open. It was under public scrutiny. We've not been like that in Britain, unfortunately. Going back to the time of the Smuts report, all the hearings were held by General Smuts in private. So I think it's a great advantage sometimes for these things to be held under the full spotlight of publicity.
We should return to that. I want to return to that at the end, because I think that in a lot of ways the sort of the tone of the conversations over this very subject have sort of switched places in the United States and the United Kingdom. And I think in the United States that's sort of been as a response to Air Force independence in 1947 and to the really nasty inter-service conflicts. But I mean, just to sum up, and I want to see if you agree with this with this blanket statement.
Sure.
The Royal Air Force initially justifies its independence through the imperial policing role in the 1920s, and keeps that argument up into the 1930s by shifting over to a strategic bombing and offensive role.
Yes, that's right.
But the combination of these two leaves the RAF essentially unprepared to conduct either by the time the war rolls around in 1939, where it has all of these plans for offensive strategic bombing, but it can't carry them out because it doesn't have the plans or the bombers or the training to do so.
It doesn't have the money either, of course. These bombing plans are very expensive. It's very difficult, I think, for a country such as theirs to have that sort of, or to have that sort of policy at that particular time, because it's Great Britain that's vulnerable to bombardment, not a European nation like Germany. We're a small country. A plane doesn't have to fly very far to get from one part of the country to another, but to fly aircraft from Great Britain to Germany means long land approaches, easier early warning, and of course the targets are far more dissipated. So it's far more difficult for the British to have a sensible and effective bombing policy of this nature. But of course, trying to pursue that sort of policy with very limited resources does mean, of course, there's less money available for other parts of the defence, other parts of the Royal Air Force. So Coastal Command is neglected. It starts the war with a load of old aircraft. Nobody's very interested in it. It's not part of the Royal Navy where you would think it ought to be, but it's not part of the Royal Navy, but it has nothing to do with the bombing side of things, so that's neglected. Nobody really knows what to do with Coastal Command. Fighter Command is also a Cinderella service, and it's not until a fairly late stage that people start to take an interest in fighter development, because, as you know, in the 1920s, there's a very small speed differential between fighters and bombers. So you can understand, in a way, how people think, well, the bomber will always get through and there's no point in having a fighter defence. All that changes, of course, in the early 1930s with the fast 8-gun monoplane. And, of course, Dowding recognises this. And the concept is not pushed through by the Air Ministry because they're not really that interested. What they're interested in is bombers. They continue to be interested in bombers throughout the interwar period and throughout the war itself. So there's never really as much interest as you would despite the Battle of Britain's success, there's never really that much interest in fighter development. And we very nearly start the Battle of Britain without any Spitfires at all.
Right, and this also we should note before we move on, because we do have to talk about the remembrance. But this has a fairly catastrophic effect on the Royal Navy's carrier force as well, in terms of the aircraft that it can put, both the carriers and the training and operations, in sort of in comparison with the two other major carrier powers, the Americans and the Japanese, who are light years ahead of the British.
Absolutely. Well, the RAF, the Air Ministry, has taken the means of production. I think it's fair to say that the Admiralty has kind of lost interest in air power, because essentially a lot of the responsibility for it has been taken away from them. So they have input into the design of the aircraft, but they don't have full control of the means of they don't have any control of the means of production. So I think they tend to lose interest in the use of aircraft at sea, and then they concentrate on things like ASDIC, because that's something they can do something about. It's a similar situation with the Army. They don't have decent air support because they can't control that air support. The RAF controls the air support, and they can't do much about that. They do try and work together, but it doesn't work very well. So I think both the Admiralty and the Army and the War Office tend to go into their own shell, if you like. So everything then works on different lines, goes in different directions, and we don't get a proper joined up system of defence. And that's where I think, to a certain extent, we're going wrong now. You've got the Army, not so much the Army, but you've got the RAF and the Navy constantly pulling in different directions. And that's gone on ever since, really.
Right. So let's get back to that in a second. So over the past 5 years, we are having, because people like round numbers, right? So we're having the 70th anniversary very slowly, or very quickly, followed by the 75th anniversary celebrations of the Battle of Britain. And this is all terrible for World War I aficionados, because the unfortunate thing about World War I is that it happens exactly 25 years before World War II. And so things are always overshadowed for people who are interested in World War I, even the 100th anniversary. But anyway, so how would you characterize the reception of media and sort of other historians and the broader community within the United Kingdom to the argument? This is not the first time that many of these arguments have been made, but it is one of the most recent and most important times that they've been made. How would you characterize the receptivity of the public and the media to this argument about the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force?
Somewhat hysterical. I think, well, let's just go back a few years to, I think it was round about the time of the 70th anniversary. 3 Staff College historians supposedly came out with a statement that the Royal Navy won the Battle of Britain. Now, this was widely reported in the press. I think it was during the so-called silly season, when perhaps there weren't any other stories going. Shortly after that, I had an article published in BBC History magazine in which I suggested the Royal Air Force was not ready for the Battle of Britain. Now, I bent over backwards here to say that this was nothing to do with the heroism and exertions of the few. That's unquestioned. Their heroism is beyond any dispute. But I think it's quite reasonable to criticise the Royal Air Force as an institution. And most people here seem to think that fighter command was a well-oiled machine, and it wasn't. So what actually happened was I was contacted by the Daily Telegraph, and I gave an interview to somebody there. It wasn't very well reported. And then at the end of the story, there was a blog thread which said, after all this time, do you think it's right for the few to be criticised? Well, of course, you can imagine what the response to that was. So there's a hysterical response to that. So we have the Daily Telegraph putting in this very mischievous blog thread suggesting that this was all an attack upon the pilots, when in fact it wasn't, nothing to do with that at all. The reporter then passed on my details to ITN News. They phoned me up and did a short interview with me. And then, of course, on ITV, on ITN News, I mean, this is broadcast throughout the whole country, they said, see, what would Churchill have thought about this historian who's criticised the few? And then they got an elderly veteran on, got him to display his medals, and they said to him, what do you think about these people who've criticised you and your colleagues? This is the sort of thing they do. So it's very difficult in this country to make any seemingly negative comment about the Battle of Britain without being accused of making a personal attack on the few. And this is not the case.
That's fascinating. I wrote the book on abolishing the U.S. Air Force, and what's fascinating about it is that there have been a few, I did a fair amount of media, and there have been a few sort of very vitriolic commentators, but mostly it's been quite respectful. They had me down at Maxwell to talk about the book, right? Mm. And so it does suggest that the cultures of historical remembrance are really quite different. Yes. And I say some fairly negative things about the combined bomber offensive in Grounded, and some of that was taken badly, but not with any kind of vitriol that you just described, the sort of press attention. I guess it speaks to the sort of the space that the Battle of Britain occupies in British national mythology, and the space perhaps that Churchill occupies and Churchill's speech occupies in that.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's very difficult to go against that. But I think this is quite dangerous because I think we now have an RAF that has a Battle of Britain mentality. It seems to think that the air defence of Great Britain can safely be left in the hands of the Royal Air Force. And, I don't really think the RAF is really capable of defending us now. We now have a situation where the Royal Air Force just has a few score aircraft. For the same amount of money, France has hundreds of strike aircraft. But the main threat we seem to face now is from air-launched cruise missiles dropped from Russian aircraft. Now, Great Britain is very vulnerable to attack from 360 degrees, as it happens. Other NATO countries have quite efficient ground-launched missiles that are capable of intercepting these cruise missiles. Over the sea, we have very little. I did ask an RAF officer about this, and he said, everything's in hand. We have these Storm Shadow missiles, they're fitted to the Typhoon, but he didn't actually say that the Storm Shadow missile isn't capable of hitting a moving target. So in fact, if we have any air defence at all from the West, it's provided by you guys. Missile systems carried by the United States Navy. So, but the trouble is, the Battle of Britain mythology tends to blind everybody to all this. And at the moment, we have a strategic and security defence review going on at the moment. Now, I think it's quite interesting that all the strategic security and strategic defence reviews seem to come up on Battle of Britain anniversaries. The last one was at the RAF's the Battle of Britain's 70th anniversary. This is the 75th. Interesting that Prime Minister David Cameron's constituency includes RAF Bryce Norton. So his constituency, depends to a large extent on RAF votes. So, given the potency of the Battle of Britain myth, and given things like that, is it very likely that we're going to have a sensible discussion about the future of the RAF? I'm a taxpayer. I want value for money. I'm a British citizen. I want defence. Why can't we talk about these things? And we're not able to, because all this puts a fog of sentimentality over the whole issue. Right. We just can't talk about these things.
Right, and the inter-service conflicts that you described in the interwar period have obviously not ceased.
I don't think they have.
Sort of one of the more recent, more vicious ones, I think, was the end of of essentially the fleet air arm of the Sea Harriers and the loss of the Harriers, in part because of the RAF, in part because of the government, but essentially leading to a situation in which the Royal Navy had no carriers, no ability to contribute to air defense besides the D-class destroyers. But this sort of conflict still plays out. This inter-service conflict, which still pits the RAF and the RN, especially against one another. The British
they cover it up as much as they can, but you know it goes on. I hear rumours, but they are only rumours. But they certainly won't admit it in public. They stress jointery, cooperation, as you would expect. Mm-hmm. But it's very hard to believe, given the history, that the problems don't exist. There was certainly evident in the 50s during the Sands Review, when the Royal Navy was expected to take a big hit. And during that time, the RAF provided plans which would have amounted to abolishing the fleet air arm. And some, slightly dodgy financial figures were produced to support the argument. Fortunately, the first Sea Lord of the time, Mountbatten, was an excellent communicator, and all this was seen through. And in fact, the Navy took a far less of a hit than the RAF did. And then later on, of course, in the 60s, we have the East of Suez problems, when we were withdrawing east of Suez, and basically we were talking about scrapping the carrier force, and the RAF put forward an island plan in which they could take over our remaining east of Suez obligations by using land-based aircraft. The new proposed TSR-2 that they thought would be adequate for the job. I thought this was part of Royal Navy folklore, but it seems during the negotiations a map was produced which moved the continent of Australia some 200 miles in order to make the in order to make this plan viable and bring Australia within reach of the TSR2, the proposed TSR2. Of course, in the end, the TSR2 plans were scrapped by Dennis Healy's review. And the Royal Navy's aircraft carriers were proposed new aircraft carriers, similar to the Queen Elizabeth that we have now. They were scrapped as well. So, and the net result of that inter-service dispute was that the RAF didn't get the TSR-2, the Navy didn't get the carriers they wanted.
You see, in the United States, it works out differently. The Navy and the Air Force have a gigantic fight with each other in 1950 about the B-36 versus supercarriers. Yeah. And eventually everybody gets everything. The Navy gets a bunch of supercarriers, the Air Force gets a bunch of useless bombers that can get shot down by a MiG-15 in 15 seconds flat. But everybody's happy because we spend lots of money. So
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Tony. This has been fantastic.
I hope that stuff was useful.
For our audience, I think it will be. For Entanglements viewers, thank you for watching, and we would love to have you again on it sometime, Tony.
Right, thanks so much, Rob. All the best. Thanks a lot.